Thank you to all of you who gave up this absolutely gorgeous Friday morning to come and sit in the dark. I think if I lived here, I'd be outside, but thank you for doing so. Thanks also to Crystal Lee and Jennifer Cow for arranging this lecture series, and to Melissa Abe, Etsuko Kobata, and Casey Yang for arranging other events here. I'm delighted to be here. This is a wonderful subject, arts on the move, artistic translation and transmission in the Mongol period. So we are talking here about the period from 1200 to 1350, when much of Eurasia was under the auspices of Genghis Khan and his descendants, the Golden Horde. Here. The Golden Horde, descendants of Chenghis's oldest son, Jochi, the Chagatayans in Central Asia, descendants of his second son, Chagatai, and the Yuan dynasty, established by Tolu, his third son's son, Kublai. In case you hadn't gotten the point, the Mongols were what we call ultimogenitors. They followed the youngest son rather than the oldest. The oldest gets sent as far away as possible, lest he try to usurp the throne. And then the fourth of these dynasties, the Ilkhanids, was Kublai's brother, founded by Kublai's brother, Hulagu. This is an exciting subject. It's my favorite, but it's also an intellectually really exciting subject because it has changed extraordinarily in the past 2 decades. This is the traditional view of the Mongols, exemplified by Matthew Paris's 13th century image of the Mongols as cannibals, the Mongols as marauders, the Mongols as people who were bloodthirsty and did nothing but conquer. And this is what the chronicles will tell you. But that's because the chronicles are written by the people who were conquered by the Mongols. The Mongols didn't write, they were nomads. And so for years, people have known about them and studied them only from what was written by basically their enemies. This all changed in 1998 with a book that's on your list by Thomas Olson, Commodity and Exchange. And he looked not at the chronicles, but at the things. The problem is he's a historian, so he looks at the things in chronicles, not the things that are on the ground that actually exist. So when you get his book, if you read it, it's wonderfully readable, but it has no pictures. I don't think he ever looked at an object that he was talking about. But that's my job today, so I'm going to tell you about that. And what's exciting also about this field is that art historians have been in the forefront for at least a generation, saying, but wait, the Mongol period is extremely creative in terms of art. Something's going on. It's not all battles. It's not all warfare. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And to do so, to talk about this transmission, I thought I would address 3 subjects: the movement of people, the movement of goods, and then the movement of ideas. So let's start then with the movement of people. As this map shows you, the Mongols themselves were much on the move. All those arrows are different Mongol conquests. I checked on Google Earth. It's about 4,500 miles from Karakorum, that's the old Mongol capital, over here to Tabriz, that's the capital of the Ilkhanids. So most of these Mongols traveled 10,000 miles. Think of that. On horseback, no water. Not only did the Mongols move, but they appreciated craftsmanship, and when they came back, they often forcibly brought craftsmen with them. So, for example, after the conquest of Herat in 1221, they moved 1,000 weavers of gold and silk brocade. And that's the little green arrow here. They brought them first back to Beshbalik on the northern slopes of Tian Shan, And then under Ogadai, next green arrow, these weavers are then dispersed to regional centers. And some of them, third green arrow, actually get sent back to Herat once people have absorbed in China how to weave with gold thread. This movement then meant that artists were transferred, and so were the skills to make this kind of new cloth. They transformed the nature of production, weaving this cloth of gold. And here's one example that survives that's attributed to Central Asia. Other artisans moved in this period away from the Mongols, more on their own account, whether they were fleeing from the threat of the Mongols or seeing more lucrative work in the West. So if we go again back to Herat, 1221, conquered by the Mongols, just before the conquest, we know that craftsmen moved across, moved to Mosul, and we know that again by objects, because the technique of inlay, this wonderful inlay, which was used first in Herat before the Mongols arrived, then gets transferred, and we have whole schools of metalwork that flourish in Mosul after the Mongol invasions. Lots of other people traveled too in this period. Once we have the independent Khanates, European rulers sent embassies to the Mongols. So, the Plantagenet kings Edward I and Edward II sent missions from London to the Ilkhanate court in the hopes of securing an alliance. And we actually have their papers still in London, the records, the documentary records of their journeys. The group consisted of several esquires, a chaplain, 4 men-at-arms, a trumpeter, a barber, 3 falconers, a cook, and several garçons, whatever, a garçon. And the gifts they brought, interesting, gear falcons. Can you imagine traveling 1,500 miles on horseback, taking care of 3 falcons? But this was the gift they presented. We know about these gifts, and I'm not sure how much you're going to see in this, from other embassies as well. There is a scroll in the museum here with a procession of foreign envoys with tribute. They include a lion, an incense burner, 3 horses, and lots of other gifts. And this seems to record a mission sent by the Catholic Church of France in 1342, sending horses. Horses were particularly prized. Also incense and pearls. So I tell my students I do my best to wear jewelry that's appropriate. So I put on pearls and coral, both of which were probably sent from the Gulf and might have ended up in China. Merchants traveled. This was a period of great trade. And I think probably the most familiar one you know, the most famous is Marco Polo, who sets off in 1227 and goes to China and writes his memoirs 3 decades later. His descriptions of his travels are some of the best records we have, but we have to remember he was a romancer. And his account tends to glorify what he wants to see. It's also a giant shopping list. If you read it, his descriptions of cities are what he wanted to buy or could find there. Other traders move not just overland, but by sea. So we have merchants, mainly Muslims, who set up trader ships known as ortag with the Mongolian imperial family. They came in these nice little maps, nice little arrows and on the map. And the presence of Muslims can be documented by mosques. Here's one in Hangzhou. And tombstones. And tombstones are invaluable because they have dates on them. So they establish nice and clearly that Muslims were here in the early 14th century in Hangzhou. It's not all west to east. Some travelers moved from east to west. Oh, we have one more, sorry, west to east first. William of Rubric, we have pilgrims who became ambassadors at the same time. He was a Flemish Franciscan missionary, and his account is one of the classics of medieval literature. He accompanied Louis IX on his crusade, and then on the orders of Louis was sent on a missionary journey to convert the Tartars to Christianity. He traveled 9,000 kilometers, about 5,500 miles. First to the court of Batu in Sarai, and then all the way over to Karakoram in Mongolia, where he left an extensive description of the city walls, the markets, the temples, and of the Mongols themselves. And those are, I've never been, some of you in the group I know have been to Karakoram, so I have to take my pictures off the internet. Now these are the ones who went from east to west. The most famous, and all of these names and their books are on your study guide. Rabin Sauma, I should tell people about their cell phones, just to remind you it's good to turn them down. He went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, or he set off on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Here. He got as far as Baghdad, where he lived for some years. Before he was sent as Mongol ambassador, he becomes the Mongol ambassador to Europe. He goes to meet many of the European monarchs, as well as the Pope, trying to establish one of these ephemeral Franco-Mongolian alliances. And we know he went because of art. The presence of Mongols is clearly documented. Here's Ambrosio Lorenzetti's altarpiece in Siena, and we have several figures, including this Mongol, who has nice Mongol physiognomy, Mongol hairstyle, Mongol dress, including this robe that ties to the right, and this plumed hat. He's clearly a Mongol. And of all these travelers, the most famous, or the one who went the furthest, was Ibn Battuta, known as the Tangerine, because he comes from Tangiers, not because he was orange. He goes on Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and then he travels for 30 years, across some 73,000 miles, 44 modern countries, across Asia and Africa. To my mind, what's even more amazing is that he never paid for a night's lodging. This was the freeloader. He stayed with various rulers or in madrasas or religious schools like this one that's still extant in Delhi. When he came back near the end of his life, he dictates an account of his journeys, a gift to those who contemplate the wonders of city and the marvels of traveling. Perhaps I should tell that to my husband, who lost his suitcase on the way here and was not a happy traveler about the marvels of traveling. Ibn Battuta is nicely translated into English by Sir Hamilton Gibb, but it's 4 volumes. You can read a more condensed 1 volume, but it's a comprehensive account of all the personalities, places, governments, customs, curiosities of the Muslim world in the second half of the 14th century. It provides a picture of medieval civilization widely consulted still today. So what we can see from all this is that this was a period from about 1200 to 1350 when people were on the move. And with them, they brought objects. Oops, I think we have another cell phone. So I have space here really only to talk about three major types of object. And I chose them because they illustrate very different paths of transmission. I'm going to talk about textiles, books, and ceramics. All objects that change the nature of production in one place or other. So let's start with textiles, which were the most important object that moved in this period. And the one that's the focus of Olson's book, these gold and silk textiles. And it's no wonder because, one, the Mongols liked gold, and two, textiles are foldable and transportable. And they provide almost the same as currency on the move. Now, these textiles, which are known in Arabic as nasij, or in Persian as nakh, or in Italian as pani tartarici, just the fact that we have so many words for the same thing shows you that they turned up in a lot of different places, are drawloom silks made of silk and gold thread, silk that's actually wrapped with gold. They typically are a lampas weave, which is a compound weave where you have extra wefts, and it's the extra wefts that allow the gold threads to rise and descend so you can have patterns of gold. Very, very few are preserved in the Muslim lands where they were made. Why? Muslims don't bury their bodies with goods. There are no grave goods. So these textiles in the lands they were made were actually, what I like to say is, worn to death. If you had a beautiful textile and it was your outside robe and you spilled tea down it or ink, well, you just cut it up and made it the inside of your robe. And when that got a little tattered or got holes in it, you made it the interfacing or the lining, and there's nothing left. Because most of the textiles that are preserved in burial contexts. So some of them, we're going to see, are preserved in Christian churches, and some of them are preserved in Chinese tombs. But we have nothing from the big hole in the middle where they were made. And we're going to see how politics, modern contemporary politics, has affected the discovery and distribution of these goods. Here's one of the ones that's just come on the art market in the past 2 decades. Half of it is in Doha, and you can see the detail here. It's a pattern of repeating circles with these 2 birds that face each other. That's typical of patterns that come out of Iran and other places. But we have nice little dragons. And those are typical of Chinese art. So most people attribute this textile to Central Asia, halfway or on the way between Iran and China. These textiles mix motifs such as peonies, lotus flowers, and dragons with Iranian ones like roundels with paired birds. But what's interesting is that 6.5 lengths of the same textile are now in the Doha Museum. So those are the same 2. I'm sorry, the colors are very different, but that depends on the photography. So we have half of a loom width in Copenhagen, and 6.5 more in Doha. Probably meant originally as a tent, and that's how they've been installed in the Doha Museum. So, how did they suddenly show up so that they could be bought by Copenhagen and Doha in 2000? The scenario scholars have put together is that these textiles were sent to Tibet, to Buddhist monasteries, because some of the Mongols in Iran and elsewhere were Buddhists. And following the dissolution of the monasteries with the Chinese occupation of Tibet in the 50s and 60s, these textiles came down to India and then out onto the art market. Because just like the Mongols like to move textiles as money, so did fleeing people from Tibet. They brought these as some of the few things they could carry out and then sell. We can't trace their provenance because all of this is speculation. And furthermore, none of these, as you see, are in American or European national museums. Why? Because their provenance is undocumented. Most of them are bought by museums in the Gulf, in Russia, or private collections as in Doha. So we don't have many of these in public museums. They can only represent some of the many textiles that were transported from Iran and Central Asia to China. But others went in exactly the opposite direction. Chaucer mentions cloth of gold in the Canterbury Tales. And we have one textile that was indisputably made in Iran and then exported west. So, it's in the Diocesan Museum in Vienna. There's a larger detail and a smaller detail. It's again a staggered pattern, this time with peacocks and peonies in roundels or in lobed medallions in the middle. But it has also a band with an enormous inscription. And as historians, we love the inscription because it has the name and titles of this ruler, the Ilkhanid ruler of Iran, Abu Sa'id. And it asks for blessings on him, so he must have still been alive when it was made. So it has to have been made sometime in the 1320s or 1330s as an official textile for the ruler of Iran and Iraq. But when he died, unexpectedly young, and probably from cirrhosis of the liver, like most of the Mongols, the textile with his name on it was of no use. He had no heirs. Nobody wanted a textile with the name of the deceased ruler. So it seems that Italian merchants picked up this textile and moved it, took it to northern Italy, where it's transformed within 30 years into the burial shroud of Duke Rudolph IV of Austria. And that's why the full garment is this funny shape, because it was cut to fit the body of Rudolph IV. So that's 3 decades. Abu Sa'id dies in 1335. At that point, this gold textile is useless in Iran. So it gets shipped west, and by 1335, Rudolph IV, or his heirs, are buying it as the most precious thing they can think of in which to wrap dead dad. But it doesn't, so here's where it goes. It goes from Tabriz to Venice, where he dies. It gets moved then, and then taken to the ducal crypt in St. Stephen's Cathedral in his capital, Vienna, and that's where the silk remains today. It was a textile on the move. From Tabriz, probably by Venetian merchants, to Venice, then to Milan, where he dies, and then on up into Vienna. So here is what his crypt looked like when they excavated it, and the garment was, here he is with his sword, and it was wrapping his body. There's St. Stephen's in Vienna. And this is an old picture of the ducal crypt, and his body was right here wrapped in this wonderful silk of gold, textile of silk and gold. Textiles were the economy, the basic economic driver. And these silk and gold textiles were the richest. But they were not the only textiles that moved. Another one that came up at this period was the knotted carpet. We have a few preserved again in Anatolia, in what's current-day Turkey. But others have come on the art market recently. Again, probably from Tibetan monasteries, brought down by fleeing Tibetans. So one in the Met that's intact, one in Doha that's been folded. And what we imagine with some of these is that they were originally sent to places like monasteries in Tibet, folded, put on the shelf, and left there for 600 years. And hence, these terrible fold marks. A lesson, don't fold your textiles, roll them up. Typical of these textiles, stylized animals. Can you all see these are some kind of quadrupeds with one leg up in the air? There's the tail, there's the head. Same thing over here. Here are the 4 feet. In this case, we don't have the raised foot. And cutely, they are themselves decorated with textiles, with animals. So here's one animal, and it has another animal, as like a saddle blanket with an animal on it. Typically with pairs of animals facing or confronted animals. What's interesting is that we can figure out how these textiles were used in Iran, where some of them were made. They were placed under the throne, right here. And we know this from my favorite manuscript of all time, the Great Mongol Shahnameh. And I have some details. So here's the painting again. Here's the detail. They were placed under the throne. Detail of the carpet, clearer, I think, in the drawing. And here's the same kind of animal with one raised leg, just like this. So these textiles, these knotted carpets, must have been prized in their homeland. We think this was really the period when people started making large numbers of knotted carpets. Knotted carpets have been around for millennia, but not very many. And suddenly in the Mongol period, they're placed under the throne, meaning they're expensive, they're important. And since they're expensive and they're important, they get exported. So, by the 15th century, they start showing up in Italian paintings. A detail, standing under the marriage of the Virgin, detail of the carpet, and I've put the carpet up here. Notice once again the raised foot, and that's exactly what you have down here. Head, 1 foot, second raised foot. What's even more interesting is how expensive and important they must have been in the Italian world, because where are they put in the paintings? Under the Virgin, often under the throne of the Virgin. So it's the same idea, we're using them under the throne. One here I even circled, so you could see it, the raised foot, which is exactly what shows up in this early 15th century painting in the National Gallery in London. But just like gold and silk textiles, knotted carpets not only move to the west, they also move east. And there's recent work been done on the carpets from the Yuan Festival in Kyoto. They have a parade every year. And scholars have recently, so recently that they're only published in black and white, nasty little scholarly publications, pictures of these wonderful textiles, a group of 21 of them, They have the same kind of stylized borders around the edges, but much more Chinese-like motifs in the middle. A prunus branch. Most of them have been dated now by carbon-14 to the 14th or 15th century. And what they show is that carpets must have not only been exported to Japan, but that some of them must have been made in China with these Chinese motifs of the two dragons chasing a little, or two tigers chasing a little ball, or these prunus blossoms over here. So what did textiles show us? They show us transmission to Tibet, all the way to Central Europe, and to Japan. So all these little blue ones are transmission of textiles from Iran or Central Asia as far as Japan, and ultimately in the West to England. If we look at a second kind of object, and that's book painting, we can see a totally different kind of transmission. That's centripetal transmission from China and Europe to Iran. Now we know that illustrated books had been produced in Iran much earlier in the region. They were a major art form only, though, from the Mongol period. It's during the Mongol period that books, illustrated books, become a major source of artistic production. They cover more subjects, they have bigger illustrations. And the one that I want to talk about, and the one that I've written about a lot, is this compendium of chronicles, which is basically one of the first universal histories that doesn't just present people as isolated or as extensions of their own geography, but attempts to look at them in terms of their own epistemological worlds. It was written by a vizier, a minister, or compiled. We can hardly say written, it's 4 volumes. Compiled by a vizier named Rashid ad-Din, and he himself is interesting because he is a Jew who converts to Islam and works for the Mongols and writes in Arabic and Persian. So he exemplifies the sort of polyglot nature of this society. This work is composed about in the decade from 1300 to 1310. It's first just a history of the Mongols, but then it gets expanded to be a history of the world. We have a history of the Islamic lands, and then the other peoples of the world that the Mongols encountered. So we have the Turks, the Chinese, the Jews, and the Franks, and the Indians. So here you have the history of the Prophet. That is the Prophet Muhammad. Muslims don't like to see that because here is the Prophet Muhammad shown nicely with a face and no problem made for a Muslim court in the 14th century. This is the history of the Jews, and I think you can all recognize the scene. Jonah and the whale. Jonah, who's been spit out by the whale over here on the shores. What's really interesting about this, which is one of the first large illustrated books produced in Mongol Iran, is that the artists had to draw from both East and West. They didn't have many local traditions for how to draw these pictures, so they borrowed. This Mongol court culture from several sorts of evidence from the different regions. We have travelers' accounts, we have objects, many of them recently excavated in China and the territories of the Golden Horde in southern Russia. And we have paintings, particularly from Rashid ad-Din's Universal History. And these paintings have mostly been detached. They came from Volume 1, The History of the Mongols, and they're now in albums in both Germany and the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. So that's why this painting and several of the others you're going to look at, which would have been a double page in a book, is now divided up into 2 separate pages with funny different numbers on them because they've all been remounted in margins. So, for example, we have William of Rubric, and that's why I started with the travelers, describing Batu's court, the court of the Golden Horde. Batu, he said, sat on a golden throne that was deep and broad like a couch, completely overlaid with gold, with steps leading up to it. One of his wives sat at his side, with male courtiers to his right and females to his left. In front of them, here, was a bench with kumis, that's the fermented mare's milk that led many of them to destruction, served in gold and silver goblets decorated with precious stones. So that's pretty much what we see here: the throne, the Han, his wife, the ladies on the right side, and the gentlemen on the left. If we look a little closer, we can see that the same transmission of this Mongol court extends to the objects themselves. So they are all wearing these robes, and recently they have been digging up these robes. Again, these are particularly prized by Middle Eastern potentates and Russian oligarchs, which I guess reflects the taste from the 14th century to the 20th, but there are a lot of them in Russian private collections. There are a lot of them, this one is in Doha. The Aga Khan went for that one. We have some in Copenhagen. But they typically have a cinched waist, a wide ribbed waistband. That's why I showed it to you. It's easier to see there. They cross from the right to the left, as opposed to the Turks, whom, according to Rubric, tied their robes in the opposite manner. The Mongol men also braided their hair in plaits that they looped around their ears. And that's pretty much what you see here. So here we have the robe that crosses to the right. We have the hairstyle that loops around the ears. And if we could blow these up a little more, we see the same kind of things and the same kind of robes here that tie to that side. These are just the sleeves that are folded up there. But interestingly, it's not just men. Oh, sorry, we have one more detail, the hats. Mongol hats were traditionally had a flap that went down the back. Flap coming down there, you can see the flap here. They had 2 large owl feathers and 3 long eagle feathers. So here are our eagle feathers, and the round ones are owl, or maybe it's easier here. Owl and eagle. Somewhat stylized, but you get the idea. They got the feathers here and the larger ones there. Same with the ladies. Ladies at the Mongol court typically, or Mongol ladies, members of the court, typically wore a tall hat known as a bukhtak. Rubric again, our traveler, calls the headdress a bukka, said it was made of tree bark, measured more than a cubit high, and it was square at the top like the capital of a column. Hollow inside, it was covered with a silk cloth and extended at the top with feathers. Well, we know that from later Yuan silk portraits. This is the very famous one of the Empress Chabi. And recent discoveries actually bear out the physical reality of this description. We have one, again, dug up somewhere, sometime, and brought to Doha. This is the covering. Here's the column that extends, this hollow column in the middle. When intact, it would have been almost a meter, almost a yard high. A column-shaped frame with bark cloth, covered with this gold cloth, and this hat that attaches with lappets underneath it, attached by the chain, under the chin. These were elaborate headdresses for royal wives, and the fanciest ones, and I'm afraid I cut it off at the top, even had things that stuck further out. Adorned with spires, tall feathers, and decorated with pearls and gold jewelry, hence the pearls. Pearls which come from the Persian Gulf, basically. And they often had spiral ornaments at the top, the sort of little balls that come out here. So that's all part of the headdress. There's the headdress that sticks up, there's the spire, and then there's a little ball on the top. Other objects that were part of Mongol court culture. Little cups, and if you can see here, he's actually quite affectionately passing or sharing a little cup with his wife. And I could give you a whole nother lecture on Mongol women, because Mongol women were terribly important. If you notice, they're right on the throne next to their husbands, almost of the same size, sometimes even the same size. These cups, again, have been dug up, the same kind of gold and silver cup. We don't have any of them, again, from the heartlands of Iran or China, because they were all melted down and reused. But excavations at the Golden Horde capital of Sarai, or chance finds on the Kipchak steppes. We have these two examples, made again in silver or gold, many of them in St. Petersburg. What these suggest, the things that do suggest, is that many other objects that are shown in the paintings, such as the folding stools. The folding stools, we have them in here. Somewhere, yes, the folding stools, right here. The folding stools. The dragon-headed thrones. These were probably all shared and extant and examples of real objects, but they simply have not survived. They all seem to be signs of Mongol sovereignty. One other thing, in the Western Khanates, they adopted this kind of square script. First, they used ones which were done in Pagspa, a script adopted to write down Mongolian, stamped in red on documents, and these became the models for those used in Arabic. This is a local one made in southwest Iran, but using the kind of square seal script that was developed in China. Other accoutrements, other objects. This coffer. In many of the paintings of Rashid ad-Din, the attendant next to the throne carries a box or a covered bag of some sort. And there was a long debate at a conference I went to about what to call this: a coffer, a box, a coffin, simply a handbag. The original ones that were made in China seem to be lacquer over leather, bamboo, and wood with metal mounts. So here's one that's in Brooklyn, and they're a specialty of Wenzhou on the south coast of China. But more or less 8 inches across. And if you were wondering why I showed you that piece of Mosul metalwork at the beginning with the inlay, this is exactly the same shape and seems to have been made by these craftsmen from Herat who fled west to Mosul, who were producing works for the Mongol court. And so we have the same kind of bag, but reproduced in metal with the scalloped shape. We don't know what they carried in these bags. The attendant always seems to be next to a woman. So I don't know if it's her jewels, the patent of her wedding, we don't know, but some kind of official documents. What's interesting about the metal one, and I'm not sure how much you can see, but it is an extraordinary piece of metalware that's actually almost what one could call painting in metal. This is the lid. You have a scene with a Mongol lady sitting here and her husband wearing a Mongol hat sitting there, and all of their attendants ranged on one side, the ladies' attendants, the ladies on this side, and the ladies on the other side. Other shared customs. This is a scene, again, detached from the volume on the Mongols by Rashid-ad-Din, of Hulagu, the founder of the dynasty, attacking Alamut, the castle of the assassins. So here's Hulagu in the middle, and we know it because it comes up in later copies. Here he is under his parasol. Here is his entourage. These are clearly important Mongols because they have hats with feathers on them. Here is his folding stool, his sign of sovereignty. So the question is, who is this guy in the front? Well, if you notice, he's wearing around his neck and hung on a string a paisa, which is a passport or a safe conduct pass. He's a Mongol envoy officially announcing that this is a royal entourage. And contemporaries describe this as a tablet of authority made of wood, gold, and silver, and embellished with a tiger or a gyr falcon at the tip, depending on the rank and importance of the holder. It was carried by an ilkchi, who was an envoy or an official traveling on business. And we know that the Mongols revived the system of the post. And they had these envoys who could gallop from one end of the empire to another, carrying one of these paisas, which identified them and guaranteed them new horses at each stop. Marco Polo was particularly impressed with this system of communication, and he gave a long description of it, the system of highways from Han Balak to all the provinces. Posting stations were erected 25 miles apart to supply horses. And in times of need, riders, often in teams, were equipped with this paisa and sent off as fast as possible. As they approached the next station, they sounded their horn, and the fresh horses would be ready, so they'd jump off one horse onto the next, and they could cover 200 or 250 miles a day. So here's our little envoy with his hat. And look what we have left. Here's one in St. Petersburg, another in Tehran, another in the Metropolitan Museum, and a fourth in St. Petersburg. And these are clearly examples of different shapes that the paisa could take. They were inscribed in all sorts of languages and script, from Khitan to Pagspai, Uyghur, and Arabic. And their iconography varied as well. We could have some like this that just basically had writing. Others that had, the one from Tehran actually has a picture, it's cute, it has a picture of an envoy on it, just like the envoy who would have been carrying it. I like these kind of little visual puns. They all have to have a ring, because they have to be attached somehow to a string around his neck. We have stylized dragons on some of them. Others have gyr falcons and other devices. These seem to then have been used throughout the Mongol domains. During this period, shapes and designs were often transferred as well between regions and or between media. So we have metalware that is adopted in ceramic. And we have this for these wonderful stemmed cups. And this one I showed you before is in the AAM. Also for metal trays, where there is a very badly damaged metal tray in Tbilisi, so I show you the drawing, it's easier to see. That gets reproduced in ceramics as well. But notice on the metal tray, while the design is the same, the layout, the shape is the same as the ceramic, the iconography, the scene on it, is derived from painting. So here we have the same scene of the throne, the platform throne, the couch throne, with the Mongol ruler and his wife with the buktak, the big high headdress, just like we have here, and they're often sharing this little cup. Ladies on this side, there's our envelope bag. Men on this side. What's different on the tray is we have two angels and a sun drawn from the sort of typical Muslim repertoire. Shapes were copied in many media. So the so-called cloud collar, this lobed roundel, could be adopted for jewelry. It can be used as a decorative device on blue and white ceramics. It can be used on the handle of a metal paisa or on the handle of one of these golden cups. Cloud collar shape, adapted in all kinds of media at different scale and in different materials. The panel style, arranging your designs like this with something in the bottom of the bowl, another design, ringing it on the walls, and a rim, used here in an Ilkhanid ceramic. And notice also the animals in the middle of this one. The deer is cut off in the middle. The deer on the right. Probably a design taken from a manuscript where they would have seen, which would have come itself from a scroll, where they would have seen a scene that was cut off at the sides, and they've reproduced that. We have reproductions of that in paper and reproduced here in ceramic. Individual motifs were shared across media and regions as well. So the dragon and the phoenix, the peony and the lotus. These are all motifs that start in China and end up in Iran. So here we have this wonderful high-fired enamel jar here in San Francisco, and then this wonderful simorgh or phoenix over here. Lotus and peonies at the top, all Chinese motifs. The dragon on a stem cup, the dragon on a luster tile from Takht-i-Suleiman, where I know some of you have been. And did you go on the people who went on the Iran tour, did you go to VR? This is the Mongol site that was probably the Buddhist monastery. Someone was asking me for what Buddhist monuments are left in Iran. It's right by Sultaniya. It is an unfinished Buddhist, probably Buddhist monastery. We don't know. It doesn't have a sign saying I am a Buddhist monastery. That fell down and hence was preserved. And on one of the walls, unfortunately now mounted behind glass so you can't see it, is a wonderful wall relief of a dragon, very much like this. But what's interesting is while the motif gets transferred, sometimes the meaning behind it does not. So the dragon, which is an auspicious motif in China, something that's associated with royalty, gets transmitted and becomes, by the time it gets to the West, and I couldn't resist showing the Michelangelo drawing that I just saw at the Met recently, becomes an evil. So it's the same object that comes across, but not necessarily the same meaning. And art historians are sometimes a little cavalier about saying, I see a dragon here and I see a dragon there, and it means the same thing. Well, not necessarily. Also, while most motifs moved from east to west, and then from the Khanates on into Europe, or Syria and Egypt, and then to Europe, other things moved from west to east. So these stylized borders, which look like stylized script, end up on these same carpets that I showed you earlier. Materials, we already saw, move from west to east. the cobalt, which came from central Iran, and it's then exploited in China, but not nearly as high quality. It has a lot more manganese in it, and it's never used after the early period, again, with reserve painting. It's too precious. They use it only for this kind of painting, and not like the early big blue and white dishes where it's the background, where you need far more cobalt, and it's a much higher quality cobalt. This became, though, part of the palette that the Mongols loved, typically with gold. And here's a wonderful little overglazed tile with another phoenix at the top, overglazed and painted in gold. And we actually have an unusual group of overglazed enameled wares found in Inner Mongolia. At the bottom, they have the same gold and blue motifs. And again, we don't know whether the use of blue is related to the Mongol worship of Tengri, the sky god, or whether it's simply that they had a lot of cobalt in Iran and it looks very good with gold. The changes that were introduced in the Mongol period in the Western Khanates, particularly the Ilkhanate, are so extensive that Linda Komaroff recently described production as part of a new visual language. And that's in one of the citations that I put on your study sheet. One feature of this new visual language was a novel interest in perspective and the opening up of space. And such a unified landscape that runs from the bottom of the painting all the way up to the top, uninterrupted to the horizon, can be seen in masterpieces of Yuan painting. And I wanted to show it to you in an object from your collection, from the collection here, but it's a silk and it's very hard to see, but it's the same idea that you go from the horizon, from the bottom of the painting, all the way up to the horizon in one interrupted space. But it occurs on other objects as well. So here we have lacquer, and it is adopted in Iran at this time for painting. So for the first time, in the same thing, we open up the painting by the late 14th century so that you go from the bottom all the way up to the top in one single space. A second feature, in addition to the unified horizon, again found both in the Yuan, in the arts of the Yuan and further west, is monumental size. The Mongols liked big. And someone once speculated it was because the Mongols themselves were big, but Tom Olson thinks it's more than that. So the largest temple in China is this one in Suzhou, which was rebuilt but was originally a Mongol foundation. Or if we look at this beamless hall from Nanjing, an enormous single space. Same way if we go to Iran, and some of you may have seen this, this is the Mosque of Ali Shah in Tabriz, humongous, far bigger than you need, and so big, in fact, that the vault over it collapsed soon after it was built. We can see it at the tomb of Sultaniya. Those are people. It dwarfs its predecessors. Its dome is about 75 feet high. It reaches the limit of single-span construction in brick. You can't make them any bigger. They fall down. And if I show you earlier tombs of the same type to scale, this is the tomb in Bukhara, which is about 10 meters. One in the middle, that's the tomb of Sanjar at Merv. Somebody I was talking to is going to Turkmenistan. That's what you're going to see, but rebuilt. But Sultaniya has an interior diameter of 25 meters. And the accoutrements, the fittings, the furnishings made for these tombs are equally big. So this is a monumental copy of the Quran made for the tomb at Sultaniya. And I show you a woman, the conservator, turning one of the pages So you get an example of the size. It's 30 volumes. Each volume has about 200 pages in it. Each sheet measures about 1 meter across. And I know you all heard about paper, or many of you heard about paper. This paper is about as big as you can possibly make with hand paper making. You can't have a mold larger than 1 meter because a single person can't lift it out of the mold without. So this is as big as you can make it. And each page is a single sheet. And notice they wanted to show you how big it was. They didn't crowd the script on here. Look at how big those margins are. They're wasting space. Furthermore, they're alternating lines of gold outlined in black and black outlined in gold. Gold, gold, gold. The Mongols liked gold. But think of all the time. You have to have 4 different pens to write that with. A big black, a big gold, a little of each. So you're constantly putting up, putting down. A third quality, in addition to space and size, a third feature found in many of these arts, both in Yuan and further west, is an interest in overall surface patterning, typically with raised, pierced, or multi-level carving. In the arts of the West, you can see it best in stucco. This is the extraordinary plaster mihrab in Isfahan, in the Friday Mosque in Isfahan. And can you see how many levels of carving you have going on here, where the letters are on top of a scroll, itself with palmettes and other decorative motifs. We have undercarving and overplastering and piercing. And you could see it at Sultaniya in the painted plaster decoration. That's going back to the room at the back, where you have this wonderful molded, painted plaster with a raised surface. And again, these techniques get exported further west. You can trace them to Cairo. In China, the best place to see such raised designs are in ceramics, such as this Longquan ware, an octagonal vase with these raised panels in the middle. Or going back again to our blue and white, where we have these raised and pierced panels in the middle. And these designs, which may well reflect tapestry weaving in silk. Remember our lampas silks, where we bring out certain motifs, certain bosses? This may be a compound lampas or a tapestry recreated in yet another medium. We can see it not just in ceramics, but in lacquer and in enamel, much of which is also redated to the 14th century. We have shared designs, probably due to the adoption of stencils, which would allow you to reproduce the same design on a textile, on a bowl, or on a lacquer. And this was the revolution that paper brought that you heard about last time. So to conclude, many of these artistic innovations were not necessarily produced by or even for the Mongols, but it was under Mongol sovereignty in the 13th and 14th century that a climate developed to accept and even desire new and different features, from individual motifs to designs and elements of style. Visual sources, in the sense of buildings and objects, thus help us to map mental space of the period. These works are the result of increased commerce and the availability of models, but they also reflect a taste to accept the new and the different, a taste established in the Mongol period and clear evidence of people, objects, and ideas on the move. Thank you.